Well, some of you have heard this little story recently, but many of you have not, so maybe, I don't know if you've heard it or not. It's a story about Charlie Chaplin, and I have no idea if it's true or not true. But there's a story about Chaplin in the latter part of his life. He entered a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest in France. Have you heard this? He finished third. It's a really curious thing, identity. How we see ourselves and how others interpret what they're seeing or projecting onto us. I've been reminded a lot of that simple little phrase lately, what Sally says about Susie says more about Sally than Susie. Right? Did you follow it? And that's what I was thinking of as I was sitting with the scripture this week. That in this case, the way the disciples answer the question Jesus asks, Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" It speaks volumes about other people. The idea of taking one's own opinion poll seems like a really bad idea. Out of curiosity, I Googled President Trump's approval ratings over the weekend. Do you know what the popular approval ratings are? What are they? 37? I found that the all-time high for him was 47%. And then I Googled what percentage of the GOP believed President Obama was born outside of the United States. Do you know what that one was? What, how much? 60? Someone thinks 60? 80%. The problem with opinion polls is that they are exactly that. Opinion. They defy reason and even fact. So here the disciples are reporting back to Jesus. Here's what people say about you. And it's not like they're far off, right? They have a fuzzy outline about who Jesus is, but they're failing to see Jesus clearly. Even Peter fails to accurately identify Jesus. "You're the Messiah," he says. Well, the title Messiah in Hebrew, or Christ in Greek, was associated in Jewish tradition with an anointed king. You already know this. A royal figure from the line of David expected to come and free Israel from their Gentile oppressors, purify the people, restore Israel independence and glory, come with might, with military might, with power and money and privilege. And that is just not at all what Jesus was about. It can be difficult when others have an expectation of you that simply can't be lived up to, can't it? It's one of the things about Jesus that's so striking to me, because he is so clear about who he is and what he's about. He does not get distracted the way so many of us do when the world is telling us who we should be and what we should be about. He's also not afraid to correct them. Peter says, "This is who you are, and here is what you'll do. Here's the kind of Christ you need to be for my sake. For my sake. Here's the God I want for my sake." When God starts doing what we want God to do, we can be 100% certain we've created a God in our own image who is certainly not God. Jesus says, "No, I'll do the opposite. I'll be rejected. I'll suffer. I'll die. I'm going to live the human story, just like you." And that's just not what Peter wants to hear. His instinct for self-preservation kicks in, just like ours does, when we try to avoid the task of being human. When we people please in order to avoid rejection. Have you done it? Have you done it this week? This morning? Jenny might have, by agreeing to read for me. When we check out in order to avoid suffering, I'm very familiar with the ways I check out to avoid suffering. When we exchange the care of our souls for a million other things. Brunch, the New York Times, even family in some ways. We're not so different from the disciples who were just trying to save their lives or looking for someone or something to save them. In the Gospels, it's the folks on the fringes of the congregation who get the answer right. It's the ostracized and the dispossessed, the women and the children and the sick who see Jesus clearly. It's the people who are on the way with Jesus, a familiar gospel term. People who are on the way, on the journey with Jesus, who are in the places of rejection and suffering and death, because that is where Jesus is every single time. We who have farther to travel, who have much to lose, it's always been harder for us to recognize Jesus. We are busy in the act of self-preservation because there's something to preserve. I want to read you a little story. I wish I could read it with an Irish dialect, but I cannot. Can anyone? Patrick? No. Patrick. No, that didn't go over very well. Okay. A few years ago at Mass, imagine the dialect. A few years ago at Mass, I was sitting near a woman who had a small boy on her lap. He looked to be about 3 years old. It was an ordinary Sunday Mass, and the child seemed like an ordinary child. At the time of consecration, the faithful were quiet. The bell was rung, the priest held up the sacrament, and everything was as expected. Then the child, who had up to now been quiet, shouted out, "Hello, Jesus!" He dragged out the hello into one long yodel. Hello! Everybody in the church turned. Like many children, he knew an audience when he had one. So he louded out the louder, "Hello, Jesus!" I sound more Southern than Irish. It was a moment of delight. The priest looked shocked, blank, as if Jesus had turned up in the actual flesh and bone. "Shut the child up," you could hear in the fear. Theologically, of course, the child was deliciously correct. The woman holding the small boy looked mildly embarrassed, but mostly thrilled. I cannot remember anything else from that Mass apart from the warm welcome of a small child who took the story seriously. The small child whose words of welcome were the surprise of praise among the predictable. I'm guessing he'd been told to say hello to Jesus around the time the bell tolls. He hadn't yet learned the difference between an inside voice and an outside voice. But who among us learned this? So he greeted loudly, warmly, with a welcome as wide and magnificent as the world. It can be a shock to take Jesus of Nazareth seriously. But this is what Jesus asks us to do. Over and over again, who do you say that I am? What he's asking is, can you see me? And if you don't hear the question, my guess is that you're not listening. Or perhaps you're not taking Jesus seriously. The challenge for us modern-day Christians is to recontextualize and reconsider at each moment in time, each point in history, where is Jesus showing up today? The scripture tells us where he is, on the margins. But I am not quite certain. I believe that Jesus is really hanging out downtown, muttering a string of sentences that don't quite seem to belong together, punctuated with a profanity every now and then, hair matted and body odor announcing his presence long before I'm close enough to touch him. I don't really believe that Jesus is in that AA meeting. And I don't really believe that Jesus is sitting on the corner of Madison and 2nd, back propped against the brick building with a sign asking for change. Because I, like the disciples, I have a hard time taking Jesus at his word. It's a story, right? It's metaphor, right? Well, yes. And no. We must take Jesus in seriousness, in truthfulness. If we want to see Jesus, we must be looking. And we might as well start close to home, because to take Jesus seriously means we have to take ourselves seriously. We must get clear about our lives, our love and loneliness, our hatreds, our creativity, our longings and discomforts, our wounds and our violence. It is our job to hold the truth of Jesus with as much seriousness as that 3-year-old child in Mass. But it is also our job to stay in dialogue with Jesus, asking the questions over and over again, reflecting, articulating, changing our mind if need be, living out who Jesus is to us. While the reverence of the 3-year-old will serve us well our entire lives, our understanding, if left at a 3-year-old's age of understanding, will not. Our understanding must mature. The way you engage your spiritual life and participate on the way with Jesus must mature. We are fully human, but we are only human when we're having a conversation with something larger that takes us out of ourselves, turning toward others and the reality of the world. So this morning, I wonder, I've self-disclosed, I don't take Jesus very seriously. Do you take Jesus seriously? Do you know who he is? Do you know who you are? I sometimes call my mother about a recipe. Very rarely, but occasionally. I try to make something, which is nearly always a terrible idea. But I will call her and say, Mom, can you please tell me how to make da-da-da-da-da? And I'm asking her for the recipe, for the measurements. And she's always very distracted. Well, I don't know, you take some of this and then a little bit of that, and if you kind of a pinch of salt. What is a pinch of salt? I do not know what that means. And eventually, I get it. I make something. It definitely doesn't taste the way hers tastes. But I do the work of gathering the ingredients and, experimenting and figuring it out and putting more salt in because a pinch must be more than that thing I did. And she just won't give me the recipe. She just won't tell me. A cup of this, a tablespoon of that, a teaspoon of that she's never done that. And you know why I think? Because she wants me to make my own darn soup. And you know what? You have to make your own darn soup too. Only you know how to make it. Only you know your needs or your will if you're serious about it. So make your own soup. No pastor can do that for you. But we can help you. We can help you find what you need, or you can ask a friend for help. Just start making the soup. Start digging in to that spiritual life where you begin to understand and see Jesus. Henri Nouwen wrote that the only way to pray is to pray, and the only way to start is to start. So it is with knowing Jesus. The only way to deepen your spiritual life is to begin. Who you say Jesus is who you've decided to be. You can't answer Jesus' inquiry without revealing who you are. Or we could switch it around. Who you are reveals who you have decided Jesus to be. Who you are reveals what and who you have decided Jesus to be. Jesus' question is not a test. It's not about getting it right. It's the moment when you come face to face with your own commitment, your own discipleship, your own identity. It's the moment when you have to admit to what extent how you follow Jesus actually connects with some sort of confession of who you believe Jesus to be. Amen.